I used to think the scariest thing about coming to New Zealand was my first trip here as a grown-up, where I found myself as the warm-up act to Sir Richard Hadley. For the Kiwis in the room, you'll know him as a cricketer. For the Americans, you'll have no idea what I'm talking about. For the Australians, you'll just feel sorry for me. I realise now, coming back here for my second Webstock, that it is infinitely scarier to be at Webstock than it ever was to be the warm-up act for Sir Richard Hadley. There's something remarkable about, for me now, 4 days worth of Webstock, where you stand on the second day thinking, what on earth am I going to do to follow everything that has come before me? And what do I still have left to contribute? I'm not actually sure I know the answer to that, which sounds like fake modesty, but is mostly just fear. So I thought I'd talk about artificial intelligence. I realized talking about AI at a conference that is in some ways really dedicated to thinking about the web and design may feel like a bit of a bridge too far. I also realize I'm now the only thing between you and beer. So you're going to have to bear with me, and someone is going to have to promise they're going to find Mike an ice cream, because it seems to me a tragedy he's not had one of the many great examples we've had going here. So why AI? Well, because much the same way we needed to talk about the web for the last 20 years and to subject it both to celebration and to scrutiny, AI is that next shiny object. It's the next thing we're being told is the future. It's the next thing that is freighted with all of the work that being the future has. It's going to change everything. It's going to bring us democracy. It's going to make everything different. When objects bear that kind of cultural weight as well as technical weight, we should ask some questions about them. We should ask where they've come from, who brought that conversation to bear, what's its history, and where might our points of leverage and intervention be. I also realised I should start these kind of conversations with a little bit of an introduction. Mike and the Webstock team are always very kind about how they introduce me, but I realised there's that little bit of kind of self-introduction a human being should do. I am indeed an anthropologist. I'm also the child of an anthropologist. I grew up on my mother's field sites in central and northern Australia in the 1970s and 1980s. I spent my childhood living with people who remembered their country before cattle and fences and whitefellas, and who were incredibly generous with my brother and my mother and I, and took us out almost every day. I spent most of my early childhood not in school, not speaking English, not wearing shoes, and as this photo attests, killing things. It was a genuinely excellent childhood. I hasten to add, in case there's a little bit of fear about, my possible pathologies, I ate all of that. We didn't just kill it for fun, we ate it for dinner. And it doesn't taste like chicken, it tastes like fish, and it's excellent. Nonetheless, it's a very long way from Central Australia to Silicon Valley. I've spent the last 20 years of my life in Silicon Valley. Truthfully, I never planned to be there that long. I thought I was going to graduate school at Stanford. I thought I was going to study Native American history and feminist theory and queer theory. You can see how I'd end up in the tech field already, right? I was off doing those things, and in classic Australian fashion, I met a man in a bar. Like that's not classic New Zealand fashion, I'm sorry. Met a man in a bar, one thing led to another, I ended up at Intel. There's a longer story involved in there, but not that much longer. I ended up at Intel, and I've spent 18 years at Intel, where my job has really been to bring people into the business of making technology. It was partly that long, complicated thread that Jared was rehearsing for us earlier about having, we had a UX person, and then we thought, we don't know what to do with her. And ultimately we got to being in some ways enthused and infused with UX. But as of a week ago, literally a week today, I repatriated myself back to Australia. So I got on a plane with all my stuff, and I took myself back to Australia, and I started a new job. Well, I haven't actually quite started the new job, so practically I'm in limbo. I have 3 different bodies to whom I am responsible. I have kept a job at Intel where I will continue to help them think about how you drive diversity and make new technologists who have a design sensibility and a user sensibility. I am now a fully fledged professor of engineering and computer science at the Australian National University, and I am starting a new role inside the Commonwealth Scientific Industrial Research Organisation's Data 61, where I'm going to help them think about why people matter when you think about data. Suffice it to say, I think I'm going to be busy. I used to think I had 1 really good job. I now reckon I have 3 really good jobs. I also think that puts me in an interesting position to be thinking about artificial intelligence. I've spent a lot of time with the people who are making it, but I also know how to think about it as a cultural object, and that's really where I want to kind of go now. And to say, well, how is it that we think about artificial intelligence? There's lots of definitions for it. Anyone who's been in the kind of computer science field will reasonably tell you it wasn't a straight line. This is its third or its fourth iteration and appearance. They sometimes talk about those as the winters. We are now out of winter and into summer. If you don't like summer, tough shit. We're kind of in it now. It's the next flourishing of AI. There is a question here about how would you define it? And I want to kind of borrow here from the work of my colleagues and friends Kate Crawford and Meredith Whittaker at Microsoft and Google respectively, who talk about AI as being a constellation of technologies. And here we're talking about artificial intelligence, but also cognitive computing, machine learning, deep learning, computer vision, and that whole bundle of things. Now, clearly, that's one way of describing it, right? It is a constellation of technologies. But it's also the case that AI doesn't just exist as a technology, it exists as a set of conversations. It exists as a whole set of things we ourselves are implicated in and we talk about. And for me, the fact that AI isn't just a constellation of technical practices, but a constellation of social and cultural practices, is where I think there's room to open up that conversation and imagine where, as designers, as UX professionals, as humanities people and social science people, we might want to kind of stage an intervention. Of course, it's a little bit complicated for me as an anthropologist to think, well, how would you approach artificial intelligence? Because truthfully, my research method, like the methods of many people in this room and many people who've been on this stage, is I like to go talk to people who do the thing. Like, I want to go hang out, deep hang out, go do the thing that people are doing. It's a little hard to work out how you would do that with AI. Not quite sure how I would go hang out with artificial intelligence. I can imagine hanging out with the people who build it. I can imagine the worlds in which it is transpiring, but it's a little hard to think about some of the classic methodologies we have across this whole community as a way of approaching AI. What's a life journey look like? Could we do scenarios? Would there be a storyboard? Maybe. But those may not open up enough room as a kind of both intervention and a way of kind of creating new possibilities. And so for me, I found myself going really old school. I went back to the 1970s, which seems to be a kind of interesting thread here at Webstock on this particular Webstock. Parenthetically, I'm really interested about why it is that in this particular moment in time, our history is an important thing to assert. I suspect it's because we want to imagine there is something that was true and fixed in a world where that doesn't always feel entirely possible. So I too want to evoke a particular piece of history. And I want to go back to a piece of ethnographic work by a man named James Spradley, who was an anthropologist from the US, did a lot of work, most famously wrote a monograph called You Owe Yourself a Drunk, which was about hanging out in bars. It's an excellent ethnography about drinking in Chicago and a few other places. It led him, however, to be in some ways one of the foremost experts in how to conduct an ethnographic interview, or what we would call a semi-structured interview. So not your classic interview where you have your written questionnaire schedule and you are asking them 1 through 10 and hoping for some answers, but a slightly more open-ended kind of conversation. And Spradley used to say about the ethnographic interview that there were 3 different kinds of questions you should ask, and you should ask them sequentially. You should start with descriptive questions, by which he meant questions that would let the person you were talking to describe themselves in their own words and in their own language. So what are the terms by which someone would talk about themselves? What are the language choices they use? What are the ways they describe their world? And in so doing, you start to have an insight into how that person and ultimately that culture may flourish and think. Second set of questions, Spradley said you should ask are structural questions. So not how do you describe yourself, but how do you make sense of the world in which you are living? So tell me about what you do every day. Tell me about your work. Tell me about how you gather food. So questions that are much more kind of in some ways task-oriented. And then last, and I think sometimes the one we give most short shrift to, is this notion of what he used to call contrast or oppositional questions. So getting someone to tell you who they are by telling you what they aren't. So how are you different from the people over there? How is what you do different from what those people over there do? What is it that makes you distinctive versus someone else? So what Frederick Barth would talk about as boundary maintenance, here he was interested in what were the questions that would start to push people just a little bit. And so I thought to myself, well, I can't go do field work in the classic sense with AI. Maybe I could subject it to an ethnographic interview. Now, of course, I'm cheating here because AI isn't actually going to answer this. I'm answering on its behalf. So let's imagine this is a conceit of the worst order. I did briefly think of playing a video here, and I give you all homework that you should go look at this video. It was done by Jim Henson of the Muppets and Sesame Street fame. Back in 1963, he was tasked by Bell Labs to create a video about robots for one of their strategic offsites. And he created a video with a robot in 1963, and it is a self-determining, autonomous, cranky robot that digests a great deal of data, gets very cross with human beings, and ultimately blows itself up. There is some space in there in which you could imagine doing an interview, but I thought instead we might try it this way. Question number 1. It's a descriptive question. What's in a name? How did you get that name? How did you become artificial intelligence? And how might you want to make sense of that name? After all, those are both incredibly loaded terms. They're culturally loaded and they're historically specific. Were we to name artificial intelligence today, circa 2017, we might think twice about the word artificial. After all, by this point in time, artificial has become a not such good term. We might call it organic, or slow, or local. Think of all the other words we have. We might call it artisan, homemade, bespoke. We know all those words because we, have both internalized and know how to take them ironically. But artificial here has a very particular set of connotations. Back in the 1950s, in the immediate post-war period in the United States, artificial was a great thing. It was about artificial sugar, it was about artificial fabrics, it was about human-made, though I'm sure in the 1950s, man-made interventions. About making things clean and tidy and shiny and new. Of course, 60 years later, we know that all of those things had really complicated consequences. And in some ways, we would no longer want to label something artificial because in some ways, that's a connotation of not such goodness. Yet here is this word dragging its baggage into 2017. You can ask the same questions about intelligence. There is again a deeply freighted term. It's not about emotions. It's heavily invested in the notion that there is intelligence on the one hand, and it is rational and again clean and tidy and well sorted out, and on the other hand, there is emotionality, irrationality, and mess. The notion here of what is in the name, what is the name of artificial intelligence, what is the work that name does? That name carries an inordinate amount of cultural baggage. Clean, tidy, rational. Not made by nature, made by humans. So the name is already a place where you could say, what would we call it today if we were going to call it that? Would we call it that? And what is the work that name does to shape the imaginations of all of us that are building this system? Another descriptive question you could ask is, well, who brought you up? It's a classic question for anthropologists. Who are your family? Who's your mummy and who's your daddy? In this case, mostly who's your daddy, turns out. Artificial intelligence has a lot of daddies, not so many mummies. So the term AI was coined at a conference in 1956 at Dartmouth. There were a number of key figures at that conference, for the most part Americans. They came from many different disciplines, which is worth remembering. They were philosophers and mathematicians, because of course computer science as a discipline didn't really exist terribly well in 1956. Mathematicians, logic, philosophers, people who were really deeply taken with where computing looked like it was going in 1956. A number of the key participants at this conference went, computers are going to be thinking within the decade. Like, excellent. I still can't get a broadband connection at my new house in Canberra, but they thought by 1960, machines were going to think like human beings. You're like, earnest, but possibly not true. So you had a series of people sitting around in 1956, they have a conference, they want to take advantage of the incredible excitement about the future of computing that is now there. They coin this field, and they bring the participants in. The participants are interdisciplinary, they have a lot of different agendas, and they are really interested in what it might take to move computing from where it was into being like at least a brain, if not a human. Now their challenge there is, well, they're mathematicians and philosophers. They're not social scientists, they're not psychologists, They're not sociologists, but they're like, okay, we need to find someone who knows how to think about human beings. Go. Now, in some ways, for better or worse, circa 1956, the most significant psychologist in the United States, most influential, was a man named B.F. Skinner. Exactly. It's pretty much my response every time I have to say that out loud. So for those of you who aren't in on the joke, Skinner is a really complicated man. He rendered human consciousness down to basically electrical impulses in, electrical impulses out. He was pretty taken with Pavlov, so he thought you could measure electrical impulses in and electrical impulses out, and he believed that the human brain was like a machine, electrical impulses in, electrical impulses out. Now, if you're a mathematician wanting to build a brain like a machine, a psychologist who thinks that brains are like machines is excellent. It's like, ooh, happiness all round. Now, of course, the thing about Skinner was he was writing in opposition to people like Freud and Jung, who had some very different ideas about human consciousness, like significantly different ideas about human consciousness. Nonetheless, this group took on Skinner. Okay, so now you've got Skinner, people who would become computer scientists, and the Defense Department. And those are the daddies of AI. And it's worth remembering that that formative moment carries through. But people no longer remember Skinner. If you say to people who work in the AI field, what model of human behavior are you using to get to a brain? They look at you somewhat blankly, and they don't say Skinner, but they probably should. So if you were then to ask not descriptive questions, but structural questions, where do you come from? What's your history? We would know that artificial intelligence, the quest for human beings to make machinery that was like us, that didn't start in 1956 at Dartmouth. That has been a preoccupation for as long as I can think through the historical record. Human beings have attempted to make things come to life for as long as there have been human beings. The stories about humans making things come to life, in opposition to the stories about gods making things come to life, suggest that the notion of trying to reproduce ourselves is a long-standing preoccupation. The Golem in Prague, Frankenstein, the Terminator, the digesting duck. We have lots of stories about trying to make things come to life using technology. And it is important to remember that even in 1956 and even in 2017, when we have conversations about artificial intelligence, we are not having them absent that cultural history, absent that literary history, absent that part of our imagination. So if you were to ask AI where it came from, it didn't come from 1956, it didn't even come from computers. It came from a human preoccupation about reproducing ourselves without sex. Parthenogenic, I guess, in that particular regard, and it is interesting again to imagine who it is that is doing that and why. Other structural question that I always think is a good one is like, well, what do you do every day? This is a particularly good question to ask in the field, because people's answers are always stunning. If you were to ask AI what it did every day, well, I think in some ways the answer would surprise us. Most of us know, because we encounter nascent versions of artificial intelligence all the time. We all encounter algorithms, whether they are the simple ones that back-end Google, the much vaunted Netflix from this stage, whether it's about your online dating site, your banking profile, where you shop for, almost anything. You're encountering algorithms that are already doing work. They're already, in some ways, sorting the world for you, making sense of it, and delivering things up to you. We even have early examples of voice-based intelligent assistants. Whether it's Siri, Google, Amazon, we're already starting to see and feel what a world might look like when artificial intelligent agents are in it doing things for us. Now, of course, much of that is instrumental. Much of that is framed by data. The challenge with that is, of course, that data is intensely partial, rarely entirely true, and always retrospective. So what do I mean by that? Well, data sets are predicated on what's already happened, not what will happen. If you model a world or an algorithm, or you conduct machine learning on a data set, you are conducting on a data set that talks about things that have already been. It talks about the past. It builds a world on the basis of what has already happened. And I'm willing to bet there's a bunch of us in this room that don't want to live in a future based on a world that has already happened. If the past was always a predictor of the future, there's a whole lot of things that wouldn't be true today. If the past were always a predictor, we wouldn't get to be very grateful for the women of New Zealand arguing so aggressively for the vote in the 19th century and assuring that all of us got it in the 20th century, because we would have determined a world in which the past was fixed and determined our future. So as we think about a world of artificial intelligence, as we think about a world where the promise is deep-rooted, smart systems, you have to ask questions about on the basis of what? Where does that information come from? Who collected it? Under what circumstances? And in some ways, as importantly, what isn't in that data set? I'm willing to bet most of us in this room have either been to some sort of focus group, user research moment, hung out with human beings as they did their things, and we thought to ourselves, we asked you that question and you gave us a different answer than the question. And you know that there are things people aren't telling you. And it is frequently the case, the things that people aren't saying, the things that people aren't typing, the things that people are not putting into your web page are often the most significant things. So how do you model a world when the silences and the gaps and the lies and the things we hold back are frequently the most important things we might be saying, but we're saying them through our silences, not our words? We know how to think about that as human beings. Most of us do. What it might look like as a system is completely different. And of course, those systems also carry culture. They carry culture, they carry expectations, they carry ideas. Cal gave us a remarkable example of that with emojis yesterday. We know it in all kinds of other ways too. The wall behind this picture here is the wall of a shearing shed near one of the towns I call home in Australia. If you grew up in rural Australia, and I suspect in parts of rural New Zealand, you would recognise this as a wall of a shearing shed. And you would know that those are stencils from shearers noting their name and the year they were there. If you are most photo searching algorithms, you think this is graffiti and label it as such. Because it turns out we build into things cultural ideals and expectations. So what is the work you do is a question not just about the past, but about the future too. And then, of course, last but by no means least, if you imagine there are questions that are descriptive and structural, there's also the oppositional or contrast question. And if the thing is called artificial intelligence, the thing you don't want to think about in some ways is the bit that isn't the intelligent bit, the bit that is the emotional bit, the bit that is its subconscious, its id, its ego, its superego. It's all of those bits, right? If we imagine these things are artificially intelligent, even some of the founders of AI in the United States imagined that these machines would have to have systems of belief. And once you have a system of belief, you have a worldview. And arguably, if you have a worldview, you can start to have other things. A moral system, a philosophical system, perhaps you even have dreams, you may even have art. Now, the complication here is, again, one that is cultural and literary in nature. We know what machines are thinking because Hollywood has told us that for a really long time, and science fiction told us that before. What are machines thinking? Two things. Well, three actually now. First thing used to be kill John Connor. Wherever he is. We know that's, prime imperative number one. The second thing we knew machines were thinking, we knew that they were thinking, I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. I've seen attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. I have seen sea beams glisten at Tannenhouse Gate. We know what machines were thinking. They were thinking poetry and then they were going to die. So that was okay. More recently, we know machines have been thinking something slightly more problematic, which is, really, you're a bit dull. So think both Spike Jonze' Her and Ars Mechanica. What is interesting about those movies, it's not that the technology kills us, it's that it rejects us and says, there must be something better out there. So what are the machines thinking? Well, mostly they're not thinking about us. And it is fascinating to imagine why it is that that troubles us so. Even questions dating back to Frankenstein are about what might those machines be thinking. And clearly there are multiple pieces of the technical ecosystem struggling to think about this. The picture in the backdrop here is by a Japanese artist who hacked a Roomba. Bless. And in all the places it would suck up dirt, he put paint for it to blow. And so this Roomba rolls around on the floor making art, like this piece here behind me. Now, is the Roomba artistic? Maybe not. Did an algorithm for sucking up dirt turn into an algorithm for making art? Absolutely. Does it open up some really interesting questions about what that might be to imagine the machines were dreaming about things? That they had a subconscious, that they had a compulsion towards art or to all the other threads that run through our lives? Would the machines, in some ways invented to replace human labor and save us from our drudgery, become themselves irritated by having to do drudgery work? Literature tells us that's absolutely what will happen. But what would it mean to subject AI to those questions that are about what it isn't? What isn't AI and why? So where does all of that leave us? Well, my hope is that if you were to start to ask these questions of artificial intelligence, and frankly, I think you could ask these questions of lots of other technical systems and infrastructures too, it opens up a little bit of space for some other conversations and some other stories. And I think specifically if you think back through them, if we talk about why the name, who named you and why, thinking about the power and politics of names is often underrated. And we should think about what work that name does. When Google named their photo analytic algorithm Deep Dreams, they were playing on something very specific. And thinking about the power of names both to open up a conversation but also close it down is a hugely important thing. The second piece is it helps to remember our history. I'm incredibly grateful that I've shared the stage for 2 days with people who want to assert that things have a history. Technologies didn't appear fully formed as if out of Athena's forehead. They were created by people in particular moments to solve particular problems. And it does us good work to remember and reassert those histories. Partly because there are pieces in it that are important. It's important to remember that Skinner is what shaped the early AI agenda. If only because today we would go, no, not Skinner. Almost anyone but Skinner. No. So knowing who the founders are and what their agendas were ought not be erased, it ought to be asserted and critically interrogated. It also matters to know what are the genealogies of things. Not just the genealogies of the founders, but of the objects themselves. What are the stories they connect to? That Nest is prefigured by Honeywell is important. That there are earlier objects and earlier moments and earlier stories matter. That Babbage was thinking about error messages in the 1850s is a good thing to know. And it is important to remember that those objects didn't just come into existence in the now. And oh, by the way, they carry all this cultural baggage that as designers, as UX researchers, as citizens, we ought to be aware of, because that baggage will shape how those objects are consumed, resisted, destroyed, or embraced. And knowing that history, hugely important. And of course, it's also good to know what is the work that AI and other technologies are doing. Not just the narrative about the work, but the work itself. Because it means we can start to ask some questions about what else is being encoded in there. What does it mean to think about how it is that algorithms function? About what are the worlds that are being built there? If you think that algorithms are a little bit like theories, which I tend to do, what is the theoretical lens that is being imposed there, and what is the ideal worldview that is being espoused? What is the thing that is hoped for if that algorithm runs most successfully? And more importantly, what is the human condition that that algorithm hopes to produce? And how might we then ask some other questions about justice, equity, about not reproducing inequalities along the lines of race, gender, sexuality, national status, ability? How might we subject some of those algorithms to the critical theoretical tools of many of our disciplines? We could look at them through critical race theory. We could look at them through queer theory. We could look at them through feminist or Marxist theory. We could ask a whole series of questions about what is the world that is being imagined, and is that the world we hope to inhabit? Is that the world we want to build collectively, individually, at a societal level? And last but by no means least, I think there's something about starting to ask what it is that AI is and what it is that AI isn't. Because in asking those questions, we can make a little bit of room. I think the room that has been repeatedly opened up on this stage to say that technology is about more than efficiency and productivity and instrumentalist task completion. I don't want to suggest those things are bad. Those things are excellent. Those things are how many of us make our bread and butter. It is good to get things done. It is good to have systems that remember that you got things done. That's excellent. I like a spreadsheet as much as Darius does. It is also important, however, to remember that part of what it is that technology can do is be in the service of human beings. And what it is that we want as human beings isn't just productivity and efficiency. It's all the other things that you've heard here and that you know in your lives. It's about friends, it's about family, it's about community, it's about meaning, it's about art, it's about hope, and it's about love. And it's about all the other things that technology can and should do for us. So as we think about artificial intelligence, as we think about every next generation of technology that most of us are going to be lucky enough to live with and work with, I hope that the questions we ask ourselves are those questions. Where did you come from? What are you doing? How did you get here? Who named you? And what is it that you were trying to get done? And ask ourselves the questions, is that what we want to have happen? With that, I want to say thank you.